Welcome to the other side of the barrel's bottom, that is. Sadly, it's episode 24 of Good Intentions. Well, it had to happen eventually. I've covered a pretty remarkable range of games for Nintendo's two-phase NES launch, stretching from middling filler to all-time classics. But now we've finally reached Urban Champion, a game that vies for the prize of Worst Black Box NES Game, period. If not for Stack Up, this would be the undisputed victor. Or loser, I guess. And yet, Nintendo has a bizarre fondness for this game. Despite the fact that I've never spoken to or interacted online with anyone who will even vaguely stick up for the game, it shows up everywhere. Wherever Nintendo resurfaces and peddles its 8-bit library, there too shall you find Urban Champion. It's like the creepy uncle who keeps coming to family events even though everyone gets skeeved out by him because your great-grandpa keeps inviting him, oblivious to his flaws and blind to everyone else's discomfort. Not only has Urban Champion appeared in the usual venue suspects like Virtual Console and Animal Crossing for GameCube, it was even granted one of the fewer than a dozen remake slots for Arika's 3D Classics series at 3DS's launch. About the only place it hasn't appeared was on the classic NES Edition mini console, which you might take as a sign that we've turned a corner, if not for the fact that it practically doesn't matter since no one can actually buy a classic NES Edition mini console. Nintendo's fondness for Urban Champion has baffled me for a long time, but in researching this episode I realized where it stems from. This is one of the few accessible callbacks available to Nintendo to their pre-video game history. Nintendo in its early days as a game maker drew on its decades of experience making toys and arcade amusements to help inspire its game designs. As explained in the Wild Gunman and Duck Hunt episodes, those games tied back to Nintendo's 70s work by being essentially video game recreations of groundbreaking toy and arcade installations. Meanwhile, Rob was Nintendo's toy-making legacy given flesh and turned into a video game accessory. The problem is that all of these games and gadgets are built around the use of peripherals, which were designed to work with the NES hardware and on television standards that no longer exist. Urban Champion is one of the few vintage Nintendo games that ties back to the company's heritage and doesn't require the use of a light gun or robot. And my guess is that means so long as Nintendo's management consists of people who were there in the 70s and 80s and look back fondly upon those days, we'll never be entirely free of Urban Champion. Urban Champion is, of course, the second brawler we've seen on NES, and it's by far the less impressive of the two. Irem's Kung Fu was pretty state-of-the-art, featuring nimble controls, fast-paced forward-scrolling, and melee mechanics that would serve as the basis for the most influential fighting franchise of all time, Street Fighter. Urban Champion, which launched in Japan around the same time that Kung Fu debuted in the arcades, presents a far more simplistic approach, pitting two combatants against one another in a sort of reverse tug-of-war as you attempt to knock one another backwards until the other person tumbles into a manhole at the far end of the combat arena. You have a total of 5 moves, high and low punches, which can be either quick jabs or knockdown blows, and 1 defensive backpedal. Each fighter has a stamina count that winds down as they take actions or take damage. You can sap your opponent's stamina by landing a jab, but you can only knock them backward and send them tumbling into a manhole with a strong punch. Strong punches take a little longer to wind up though, so throwing them leaves you vulnerable to a counter jab. And you have to choose whether you're attacking high or low to break past your opponent's guard and defend, a bit like a boxing match. The game has some charming touches to add a little variety to the action. Every once in a while, an annoyed citizen will appear in the window of the building you're fighting in front of to express his or her annoyance at the noise disturbance out front by attempting to drop a flower pot on the participants' heads. And every once in a while, the police will cruise past on patrol. When this happens, both brawlers automatically retreat to their corners and whistle nonchalantly, which is amusing. The police are ultimately pretty annoying though, since they essentially serve as a reset for a bout. If you have your rival at the edge of the screen, you'll have to start making that progress anew once the police finish their drive-by. But when you finally knock an opponent off the screen, the fight begins again at the side of a new screen where their manhole goal awaits on the opposite end of the screen. And that's it, the full extent of this brawler. It's so simplistic and so rigid that you might think it could practically have worked as an LCD Game & Watch unit, which it turns out would be bang on. I mentioned the fact that the combat mechanics, high, low, block, jab, heavy blow, work almost like boxing. As it turns out, the reason this game feels like a Game & Watch boxing game is because it began life as a Game & Watch unit called Boxing. Nintendo fleshed out some of its 1984 Famicom lineup by looking to Game & Watch for inspiration, which probably makes sense and shouldn't be surprising. Several sources cite Shigeru Miyamoto as the creative lead on Urban Champion, and his artistic sensibilities would probably account for the game's conversion from a boxing ring to a somewhat more appealing city street populated by police and annoyed tenants. But underneath it all, this was a cheap LCD game upconverted to a standalone NES release, and the results feel a bit shabby. I have to assume that the game held up a bit better at the time of its Famicom debut, back in early 1984, than it does today, as home games in general back then tended to be just on the brink of leaping into full complexity, and if nothing else, Urban Champion does have a pretty charming visual style. But man, it just isn't fun these days. And even by the time it reached the US, 2 years after its Japanese debut, it was already pretty dated. This was made worse by the fact that it showed up right alongside Kung Fu, a game that did largely the same thing as Urban Champion, but in a far more impressive fashion. Kung Fu, while also dated, feels a lot more like a proper video game by current standards, whereas Urban Champion feels like a bonus mode that belongs in a larger, richer game experience. I suppose you could level the same criticism at a number of black box games, especially the light gun titles, which, like Urban Champion, began their life in an era before video games. Case in point, a direct descendant of Wild Gunman features as one of several dozen modes in the freshly released 1-2 Switch. But blasting bad hombres still makes for quick, accessible fun. So it's easy to recommend people kill a few minutes with the likes of Duck Hunt or Hogan's Alley. Urban Champion, on the other hand, is an experience best left in the past. Please, Nintendo, let it just stay in that manhole forever. Amen. Next time on Good Intentions, the quality pendulum swings all the way in the other direction.